Hello and welcome back to our bookshop in Tring. I'm Ben Morehouse. So we've got another author interview. We're lucky enough to have Okechukwu Nzelu talking about his debut novel, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney, a redemptive book which I know you'll all really enjoy. Oke is talking to Jamie Fewery.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ben. Today we are joined by Okechukwu Nzelu, who's going to talk to us about his debut novel, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney, which is a terrific book about a young girl growing up and answering a lot of questions about herself, her family, and her place in the world. It's been described as smart, serious, and entertaining by Booker Prize winner Bernardine Evaristo, and has recently been shortlisted for the DESMOND ELLIOTT Prize and the Polari First Book Prize. Hello.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. It's so nice to be here.
That's quite all right. Thanks for joining us. And I suppose the first thing to do would be, if you could just kick off by just talking to us about the book and what readers should expect from it. I've read it. This is the second time we've done an interview. We were talking that the last one was a great thing in person in Brixton. We'd like to do in-person events again soon. But yeah, if you talk to us a bit about the book and what readers should expect, that would be great.
Yeah, thank you. So The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney is a comedy about a teenage girl called Nnenna who lives in Manchester with her single mum, Joanie. And Nnenna, her father's Nigerian, her mother, Joanie, is white, but Nnenna has never met her father. And she doesn't know why, and her mother refuses to discuss him or what happened with him or where he is and why he's not there. So when Nnenna feels ready and prompted to start exploring her Igbo-Nigerian heritage, which she gets from her father, this makes what was a once very sort of tender and warm relationship full of humour and love with her mother. It makes that relationship quite strained, and it sort of kicks off a journey of self-discovery and mutual discovery for her and her mother. So it's about those two, and it's about their friends and lovers and the sort of the world of Manchester in which the book is set.
Great, thank you. So when I first read the book, one of the things I was struck by was how you bring together different times, places, people, settings. How do you go about knitting all that together into a novel? Are you one of the great planners? Is it all on a corkboard somewhere mapped out?
That's a good question. I find that kind of thing helpful in redrafts, but when I'm first writing the novel, I find it unhelpful to write anything down when I'm in terms of planning. I prefer to do everything in my head if I can. It feels more organic that way. The first sort of job I had after university was a really simple admin job, just filing at university, and I spent, not at university, even at a law firm, and I just spent all day filing and photocopying in this job that gave me not a lot of mental stimulation, but a lot of brain space to be able to do story planning. And I just got very used to thinking of plot and ideas in my head while I was like photocopying legal briefs and things like that. So I guess it's just out of habit that I prefer to do that. When I'm redrafting and I want to make sure everything, when I'm checking as I write, I want to make sure that I'm getting everything right. So I've been known to use a spreadsheet, but it feels somehow inorganic, but it's useful.
And so these spreadsheets, I mean, what got me about the book is it's very seamless, the way things move between these times and spaces and places.
Thank you.
Is that an editing process? So does it all go down on the page and you write more than you need and then you start trimming it back to get to those bits?
There was trimming in terms of characters. There were characters who didn't make the cut because I just thought this is getting too complicated and there's too many of them. But in terms of the time periods and sort of the way that the characters interlock with each other, that was really part of the central idea for the novel. What the sort of the concept behind the novel in a way is that I think of dynamics between people before I necessarily think of individual storylines. I thought of the single mother-daughter relationship in one, which is one that echoed my experience of being in a single parent family when I was a teenager, before I necessarily thought of all the other different bits of the story. And I wanted to write a story about lots of different people of lots of different experiences and I wanted to do that. That was my sort of main idea. And then everything else around that was just kind of the ideas that filled that in and the ideas that fueled that, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think try not to tread on too many questions I asked you last time, but I guess a lot of the viewers of this were not at that event. So last time we spoke, we talked about how you went about creating those characters. And was it was it sketches or profiles, and how you talk about, you find dynamics of relationships. How do you then turn those people into characters that are really believable?
Yeah, thank you. That's a good question, because the characters really sprung from very central, a couple of very central ideas. Like I said, I think about dynamics a lot, so I knew I wanted to have this really close, tender relationship between a mother and her child, but also I wanted to explore the tensions that can arise in that sort of situation, and the difficulties of it. So that was something I always knew I wanted to write about. But then I had a separate idea that came together in terms of their backstory. So the novel opens with a sort of a farcical scene. I really love farce. That's a kind of comedy I really, really like. And I was sitting in an art gallery waiting to meet a friend of mine at the cafe, and somebody put a postcard down advertising, I don't know, it's like an event that was coming up at the gallery or something like that. And then I guess I just thought, oh, well, what if that was more intentional, and that was something that was meant for me? What might that be like? Oh, maybe that would be a biblical quotation, which is of course what happens in the prologue of the story. And so that, because of the nature of that kind of farce, where you've got lots of ridiculous things happening at once that sort of hopefully gel together quite nicely and form this really harmonic, bizarre, fortuitous ending to that sort of prologue, lots of other stories came out of that, which I was really excited to pursue. So I guess I was really just chasing a series of ideas that I found exciting, that I sort of found myself with after that one moment sitting in an art gallery. And then it was a case of thinking, how do I join these stories up with the existing mother-daughter relationship I knew I had?
It's interesting, because it's a book that's so much, I mean, all books have plot, but this one, all the plot is driven through the characters, right? It's all through their different journeys. And I'm thinking, so you've got Nnenna and Jonathan, and then Maurice and Joanie. Was there a particular character you found it harder to write their story, perhaps because it was slightly more challenging about their behaviour or something they've done in their life, and you found it almost difficult to put that down on a page? Or did you find yourself quite distanced from all of them enough to write very honestly about?
That's a good question. Some of them are harder than others, but not necessarily because I related to some of them less than others. None of the characters is exactly me, but Jonathan's experience was harder emotionally because it's a very difficult thing that he's going through. It's a very unpleasant situation to have to write. He's in a series of relationships with people, well, mostly one relationship, if you can call it a relationship, with a man who treats him terribly, and Jonathan is going through, really serious mental health problems that he's never really had the chance to address and have sympathy for and really deal with. So that was very difficult. But what was also interesting was that Jonathan's story was one that previous agents and editors before the ones I have now, weren't so keen on. So there was actually a bit of resistance to that storyline. So it's really, and what's funny is that a few readers have said that Jonathan was their favourite character, or that they related most to him and they really liked his story most. So I'm really glad I kept that, and I had to really think about how I was going to make that story strong and engaging. And so when I came up with the monologue idea, that I wanted all of his encounters with this horrible sort of boyfriend to be told in monologues, I thought, okay, this really fits. This is something that I feel gives it drive and gives it direction. But all of the characters are really a sort of an iteration of me in some way. I think I remember what it was like to be a teenager, even though my experience is very different from Nnenna's, and my relationship with my mother is very different from Nnenna's. Joanie's experience at university is not the same as mine, but I definitely had sort of analogous relationships, experiences to her own, of that kind of feeling of being a little bit feeling a bit inadequate really, and sort of questioning yourself all the time. And they were all sort of bits of me, of things that I've experienced or observed. So it was nice to sort of put a bit of myself in all the characters.
It is interesting you say that about Jonathan. I think I found his story very compelling, probably the most compelling of the book, like a lot of other people. So it's interesting to think that, had you followed someone else's advice, that might not have even been in the story in the first place. How strange.
Yeah.
Tell us about a couple of the characters that didn't make it. I find that really interesting about the process of a novelist writing a person, becoming engaged with someone. When those characters don't make it, do you find yourself saving them for another book? Do you think, no, they're worth keeping?
That's a really interesting idea, yeah. So one of the characters that didn't make it, originally I thought Nnenna should have an Igbo tutor who would be a young woman who, because sort of Nnenna could look as a kind of a role model of, okay, if I have a stronger connection to my Nigerian heritage, to my Igbo heritage, this is maybe what I will look like in 10 years' time. This is somebody who I can imagine myself being in the future. But then I liked the idea of Nnenna having a much more open-ended ending to her story than that. And I liked the idea that Nnenna's journey isn't necessarily one about getting something, but about becoming somebody who is more able to advocate for herself and who is a happier person without necessarily sort of acquiring or sort of in any final way being anything. I liked that kind of open-endedness of the story. And at first I did think I wanted to keep that character for another story, but as I'm sure you know, stories just have a life of their own, and the next novel that I'm working on now is a very different story which doesn't quite accommodate that character. So maybe she'll turn up in another thing that I write.
It's funny, isn't it? So I've had this thing before where I've become attached to a character and then tried to find a story for them and then realised that's perhaps not the way round I should be doing it. Speak about Nnenna there and her I suppose, I hate the word journey, but I suppose there is a journey aspect to it, right? She's not going to a destination, but she's discovering more about herself and who she's going to be in the world. And you said it's a very open-ended story. Is hers the kind of story you could envisage yourself picking up again, or do you feel like you drew a line under it?
That's a really good question. Maybe. It's not what I'm working on now, but her story and Joanie's story, because there are elements of Joanie's story that are hinted at through the novel that aren't sort of fully narrated in the same way that Nnenna's story is. And of course, in a real way, Nnenna's life is just beginning throughout the novel. So maybe it's something that I love those characters, but I've also put a lot of time and thought into how I sort of send them off. So I'm also quite happy with the way that they are. So I guess we'll see. It's hard to never say never.
Interesting, isn't it? Again, about the whole idea of like, it feels like some books don't really have a sequel in them, but then sometimes when it is left open, you do realise that the character is in a very different place to where they started the book. That story feels like it could be continued, doesn't it? We talked a bit about humour a minute ago, and again, this is something we've talked about, you and I, before, but there's funny, light moments in the book, and there's also very serious moments. How do you know when that humour's working, and how also do you know when to transition from a very serious moment? Because, I mean, we talk about Jonathan, his story arc deals with some really heavy themes, but then there's also moments of lightness. How do you balance that to make sure when you come out, it's quite an uplifting book?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, this is really a trial and error thing. I sort of stumbled upon the style in which the novel is written just by rewriting and finding a groove that I sort of fit in. So using comedy was something that in the way that I use it in the book was something I just thought, I think I can make this work. I think I've hit upon something that I'm happy with. So it was really accidental. And then once I realized it was what I wanted to do, I spent a long time sort of trying to hone it. But then I in the course of redrafting the novel, as I did several times before I even submitted it, I was thinking a lot about, as you say, the balance between funny and serious parts of the book, and how they overlap. And I think that it's very much to do with this kind of British sensibility that we have. I've grown up here. My background in education is in English literature. It's what I teach now as well. And I think that as British, especially English people, we have we're very shy about talking about serious emotional stuff. We tend to clam up, we tend to get very uncomfortable about it. One of my favourite writers is Sylvia Plath, who often uses humour and bathos to get across quite serious and very painful subject matter, and like in a poem like Daddy, for example. And I think that humour really, it sort of sugars the pill a little bit. But it's a difficult balance to strike, of course, because what you don't want to do is sort of use humour in a way that undercuts people's dignity or undermines the gravity of what you're trying to say. But sometimes I think with a little bit of good timing, humour can sort of pave the way and give way to something which is a bit more grave and a bit more, not necessarily serious as such, but something which is a bit more earnest.
Yeah,
the humour that I use.
I think that comes. I think what's probably accurate about that, and that's in the book as well, is that that's how people are, isn't it? Even in the most serious situations, someone's always kind of ready to kind of crack a joke or something like that. And you know, people tell jokes at funerals. In the most serious, awful situations, there's always someone waiting with like a quip that's not overtly a joke, but just a bit of humour to put a bit of levity into a situation. You know.
Yeah, exactly. And I think we found that, you know, right now during lockdown, it's a very serious thing, this virus, but certainly if you use the internet as much as I do, you will have seen how much people on Twitter and social media have been like making jokes out of it and, you know, referring to coronavirus as Miss Rona and, you know, personifying her as this like sassy, like really rude person who's sort of trampled all over all of our plans for the year. That's a mechanism, and it can go too far sometimes, and it can be insensitive, but it's also at the lighter end and the more sensitive end, it's a very human thing to do. Yeah,
you're absolutely right. So I mean, who are the authors you look up to, or who are the authors you kind of you read and enjoy who use humour in that way? I didn't expect you to say Sylvia Plath, but I was going to ask a question about humour in literature. Sylvia Plath was not, I was like Woodhouse or something. Sylvia Plath was not the one. But who else do you read and you think, now that's the way I want to tell stories?
Yeah, it's a funny question to ask, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you know, I could point to writers that I think are maybe more visible in my work, like somebody like Zadie Smith, whose White Teeth was a huge inspiration for me, because she was, you know, she uses, again, that very British style of humour that, you know, so many of our sort of British great writers, like Woodhouse, have in common with her. But she also is not, you know, but she's one of the writers that is maybe more visible in my work, so that isn't the only writer at all that I really love and who I'm really inspired by. You know, stylistically, Chinua Achebe as well. I love the way that he writes I can't remember who said this, but he talks, he writes in a way that comments without judgment, which I think is really good. That's something that I really wanted to do, to observe and to be unflinching. So in the way that I talk about Jonathan, for example, and the problems that he's having, I wanted to be completely honest and, you know, not allow the reader to look away from the difficulties that he's experiencing with his life and his mental health. But at the same time, I didn't want it to be a condemnation, this heavy condemnation of him or necessarily even anybody else around him. Somebody who read, somebody pointed out to me something I didn't realize about the book, which is that all the most evil characters are pushed to the sidelines of the book, that quite a lot of energy in the narrative goes on trying to understand, not necessarily justify, but understand the questionable things that other people do, and that's something that I really get from something like Things Fall Apart, where, you know, we have these really complex decisions with ramifications that are very, very serious and often quite damaging, but he goes a long way towards understanding rather than judgment, and that's something I really, really love. And then, of course, there are things like The God of Small Things by Arundhati Roy, where she has this perfect timing, and she has such an eye for beauty in her sentences. And you know, gosh, there's so many people like Jane Austen. Her fascination with families, that's something that I always wanted to echo. And David Nicholls, whose sense of humour is just brilliant as well. So, yeah, there's more visible and less visible authors, I suppose, and Sylvia Plath would probably fall into the second category.
Yeah. I didn't expect that one, but it's Zadie Smith. I can see David Nicholls as well, because there is that. You like David Nicholls, I suppose. There's that thing of you write compelling characters, but then as a writer you put them in really difficult situations and then move them through it, which he does really well without ever making you fall out of love with the character or fall out of love with the story, which is a nice thing. Are you continuing? Is the next book going to be kind of in the same sort of style, or what's the next thing you're working on?
So the next book is very much a work in progress. So a lot of things about it I'm sure will change before it's published in about 2 years' time. But it is, a lot of the themes are the same. So family and redemption and connection between people who you might not necessarily put together. But the weighting of those themes, I think, changes. So the romantic relationships in this second book come to the fore a lot. Relationships, I'm thinking much more directly about masculinity in my second book. And I'm also having a closer look at Igbo culture and mythology and religion and sort of traditional religion as well. So it's nice to be getting back to my roots in that way, I suppose.
Yeah, and so because you deal with so many different themes, and then the first book obviously does, and this next book sounds like it will as well. When you sit down at your desk and you're like, I'm going to embark on this novel now, do you ever have a single-minded purpose of a story you want to tell? Like with Nnenna, it felt like you wanted to tell her story using all these other people as context and influences on her life. It seemed like a single purpose of, I need to tell this girl's story. Is that how you work?
Yeah, pretty much. I have a single idea for a story. So, teenager discovering her Igbo heritage and her relationship with her mother. But then so much around that will change, as I'm sure you know as a writer yourself from the redrafting process. Certainly for me to make it work, everything has to be on the table in terms of what can change. I have to give myself that freedom to discard that 20,000 words that I was really, really happy with, but just doesn't quite fit, or that character that I was really fond of, but I can't quite justify keeping in the final draft. So yeah, I try and keep a sort of a single idea, but then the branches of that and the leaves, I suppose, I have to give myself the freedom to be quite brutal. So, I've been working on this novel for, gosh, how long has it been? Like two, maybe 3 years, 2.5 years now. And it has changed so much. Just to look at earlier drafts of the opening of the novel, it's hugely changed. And it's nice having that freedom. It's a bit scary because I think it makes you realize how on your own you are. There is nobody giving you any boundaries but you, which can be difficult because, of course, sometimes constraint can encourage creativity. But I suppose it's just about having faith that ultimately you're going to come to a final version that reflects you and your best. Fingers crossed.
Yeah, I think it's an interesting way of dealing with it, isn't it? Are you quite a rigorous self-editor? It sounds like it. If you can work on something for that long and go back to an original opening and find it being very different, do you have a lot on the cutting room floor? There's loads of discarded drafts everywhere.
Yeah. I have a folder on my computer for all the drafts of whatever I'm writing, and this it's draft 1, version 2, October 2018, January 2019, and there are so many different versions of this, and it's terrifying, but also it is what you need, isn't it? You have to have that freedom to be able to do that and recognize when something isn't working.
And do you enjoy editing? I spoke to an author once who'd written a non-fiction book, and it was about, I think the printed version ended up being around 120,000 words. And he estimated he'd written 1 million words and then cut it back. Do you enjoy editing? I mean, if to write 1 million words, you've got to enjoy editing or be insane. But
my goodness. I mean, I think I certainly enjoy what comes out of editing. But editing is really hard work. I think when I first started writing Nnenna Maloney, and I didn't know how hard it was going to be to edit the novel, and I sort of thought, editing is sort of, just putting the finishing touches on something. Editing is the icing of the cake, and actually it's not. Editing is deciding which ingredients you want to get rid of before you put it in the oven. Editing is a really difficult, emotional process, which I don't think I was prepared for the first time. And I guess I think of editing as necessary, and I get joy out of what comes of it, but I can't say that it's necessarily accurate to say that I enjoy it personally. I like having something to edit. I like knowing that I've got a draft which I can work on and change, but also it's very difficult work. It takes a lot of energy and patience, and it's not easy.
That's the hard yards, isn't it? That's the hard yards for writing. Have you felt any change in how you write, or what the expectations for your books might be now that you've had a couple of prize shortlistings. Congratulations on those, by the way. I was pleased to see that. But has that changed the way you write at all, or what you think people expect? Or
that's a good question. It's so hard to say, especially during lockdown, because I'm not doing events. I'm not talking face to face with people who've read my book or who, you know. So maybe that's why. But I feel quite blessed in that I feel like I've got a lot of the recognition that comes from being shortlisted or longlisted for something without necessarily having much of the pressure. I'm not seeing people who are saying, oh, so what are you going to do next? What are you working on now? The only time I have those conversations are like this, when I'm talking to somebody who's been kind enough to interview me. So, and that was obviously it's a very gentle environment in which to talk. So I feel quite a lot of freedom actually in what I'm doing next. So fingers crossed, fingers crossed I can justify the freedom I've been given. But in some ways, lockdown has been quite nice actually in that kind of isolation.
Yeah, that's great. And do you find you're writing more in lockdown or not? There's been lots of people talking recently about writers and creatives in lockdown, and some people just hit a wall and felt they couldn't get anything out on the page, and some people found it a really kind of fertile period because they had time and space and they were able to concentrate. Which side of that have you fallen on?
I've felt both of those. So I teach nearly full time when I'm not writing as my sort of day job. And during our sort of 2-week Easter break, I had a really lovely period of productivity and creativity where the words just poured out of me. And, you know, for 2 weeks, I felt more or less what I imagine it's like to be a full-time writer. And all I had to do was write and read things that I was passionate about. And I was reading a book I was loving at the time called The Vanishing Half by Britt Bennett, which has just been published now, I think. So I got approved from the publisher. And I was just loving it. And, you know, when you're reading something that you really enjoy and you're writing something that you're really passionate about, and the two sort of, you know, the two stories are very, very different, but that experience, I just got so much energy from reading something I loved so much. And that was wonderful. But, you know, since then it's been much more difficult because eventually you just need something to distract you from the highs and lows of writing, especially when you're writing comedy. It's such a demanding medium when I think you get a greater share of, you know, Zadie Smith talks about the self-disgust that writers feel, and I think comedy gives you more than your fair share of that disgust, because you're not just trying to create something which is beautiful or engaging, you're also wondering, oh my goodness, is this funny? And, you know, the self-questioning that goes along with that has just been magnified massively by lockdown, because, you know, I can't just go out for dinner with a friend and completely forget about what I've been doing all day, and I can't just socialize in the same way that I normally can do, or go to the gym, or all the things from life that I enjoy which serve to distract me from things from writing have sort of been taken away, certainly for most of lockdown. Can't even get my hair cut. So it's been difficult in some ways. It's been a bit of both actually.
Yeah. Do you have some early readers that you use when you're trying to figure out whether you're talking about humour there and comedy? Do you have early readers that you send stuff to and just say, is this working, particularly in the moment where you can't take yourself out of things?
Yeah, I mean, fortunately, so the big difference between this book and the first one is that now I have an agent while I'm writing the first draft. So it's so wonderful to be able to have someone like her to lean on. That's fantastic. But I have a couple of friends as well who I will share early drafts with, and that's been really encouraging as well, to know that I can do that. And the second book is taking things in a different direction. You know, it's humour sort of takes not a back seat, but it's a different style of humour from the first one. Farce isn't so much a part of this book anymore. It's a different sort of story, and humour serves a different purpose now, which will evolve. Well, everything I'm saying could change, but it's, you know, in 2 years' time this could be all lies. But from what I'm working on now, it's different. So it's really nice to know that the new things that I'm trying from a few early readers have been sort of positively received. Yeah.
Great. Well, on that note, I'll say thanks very much, Okechukwu, for spending some time with us. Have you got a copy of the book to hold up? I said beforehand, I left my copy on my desk, and there we go. That's what the book looks like, The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney, which is available from our bookshop in Tring. And I'm going to hand back over to Ben.
Thank you.
Massive thanks to Okechukwu and to Jamie for that wonderful interview. The Private Joys of Nnenna Maloney is available in our bookshop. Give us a call on 01442 827 653. All the other purchase blurb is available in the text below this video. Please do subscribe to these videos, and we've got so many more to come, and we'll see you next time.